The story I'm about to tell you, my friends, is not one I've ever shared before. It's not a story for the faint-hearted, nor is it a tale to tell around a campfire unless you want sleepless nights. It happened 25 years ago at Blackwater Lake, a place whose name still makes my skin crawl. I was 19 and desperate to get away from the suffocating confines of my small town. So when my uncle offered me the chance to spend a summer helping maintain his lakeside cabin, I jumped at it. Blackwater Lake was secluded, ringed by dense woods that seemed to trap every sound, and its water had an odd black sheen that made it look bottomless. The locals whispered about it, saying the lake was cursed, but I dismissed their stories as old-time superstition. The first few weeks passed uneventfully. I spent my days painting the cabin's porch, repairing the dock, and occasionally venturing out onto the lake in a rickety rowboat. But something about the water unnerved me. No matter the weather, it was always eerily calm, like a sheet of black glass. There were no ripples, no fish breaking the surface, and no birds diving for a meal. It was unnatural. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, I saw it for the first time. I was sitting on the cabin's creaking porch, nursing a beer and watching the lake, the water, always unnaturally still, reflecting the towering silhouettes of pines that surrounded the shore. At first, I thought I was imagining things, a trick of the fading sunlight, or maybe my eyes playing games after hours of staring at the endless black surface. But there it was, a figure standing in the middle of the lake. It was distant at first, its shape blurred and indistinct, as if it were a shadow rising from the depths. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. It had no solid edges, no clear outline, just an eerie, undefined presence that hovered like a smudge against the lake's perfect surface. At first, I told myself it was the reflection of a tree or maybe a trick of the light bending over the water. Then it moved closer. My breath caught in my throat. The movement wasn't natural. It didn't wade or walk, nor did it ripple the water. Instead, it seemed to glide toward me, silent and deliberate. My body stiffened, and an instinctive chill crept up my spine, the kind you get when someone's eyes are on you, watching too closely. I strained to make out its details, but the more I tried to focus, the more it seemed to shift, like smoke dissolving in the air. Its face, if it had one, remained hidden, swallowed by the dusk and its own strange indistinctness. I blinked, my eyes burning from the effort of staring, and when I looked again, it was gone. The lake was empty, as still and quiet as ever, the faint sounds of crickets filling the void where the figure had been. For a long moment, I sat frozen, the beer in my hand forgotten, the world around me feeling both too vast and too claustrophobic all at once. I told myself I was imagining it. Perhaps the long days of isolation and the oppressive silence of the lake were getting to me. Even as I went inside and locked the door behind me, the image of that figure stayed imprinted in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen something I wasn't meant to see, and that whatever it was, it had seen me too. At night, I started to hear soft splashing sounds outside the cabin, faint but deliberate, like someone pacing slowly through the shallows. It was too rhythmic, too intentional to be an animal. Sometimes it would stop abruptly, only to start again a few moments later, closer to the cabin. I would lie frozen in bed, clutching the thin sheet as if it could somehow shield me from whatever was out there. One night, the splashing was so loud I thought it must be right beneath my window. I mustered the courage to peek through the curtains, but all I saw was the endless black of the lake stretching out into the night. There was nothing unusual until I glanced at the dock. There, in the faint glow of the moonlight, were ripples spreading out from the shore, as if something had just stepped into the water and disappeared. The next morning, I woke to something worse. Outside, leading from the edge of the dock to the cabin, were wet footprints. They were large and human-like, but something about them was wrong. The toes were too long, the shape distorted. The prints glistened in the early light, as though whatever had made them was still nearby. They didn't stop at the porch. My stomach turned as I followed the trail to my window. The glass was fogged from the cool night air, but there were streaks where the condensation had been wiped away. The smears looked like the marks of long, skeletal fingers, as if something had pressed its hand against the glass and peered inside. I stood there, staring at the window, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The thought that something, or someone, had been inches away from me while I slept made my skin crawl. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as though the cabin's walls were paper-thin and offered no real protection. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside made my heart race. I kept looking at the window, half expecting to see that ghostly figure staring back at me from the other side. Unable to shake the oppressive sense of dread, I made a reckless decision. Armed with nothing but a cheap flashlight and the fraying rope of my courage, I dragged the rowboat to the water's edge and pushed off into the lake. I told myself I was being brave, that I would prove the lake was just a lake and end my growing paranoia. But as I dipped the oars into the water, the silence around me deepened. The usual nighttime symphony of insects and distant rustling faded until there was nothing but the rhythmic splash of the oars breaking the black, mirror-like surface. The deeper I went, the darker the lake seemed to become. The flashlight, its beam weak and flickering, cut through the void like a thin blade, but it only illuminated small patches of the water before me. The vastness of the lake swallowed everything else, and I suddenly felt like I was floating in an endless abyss. My breath quickened, and my pulse pounded in my ears. I kept rowing. That's when I saw it. A pale face, stark against the inky blackness, stared up at me from beneath the surface. Its features were ghostly, distorted by the water's wavering sheen. The eyes were wide and empty, the mouth stretched into a grotesque, soundless scream that seemed to radiate terror. I froze, the oars slipping from my hands, unable to look away from that horrifying visage. It didn't move, but its presence was unbearable, as if it were somehow reaching for me with its sheer existence. Panic surged through me, and in my desperation to flee, I dropped the flashlight. It tumbled into the water with a dull splash, its beam flickering and fading as it sank into the depths. Darkness closed in around me, but I didn't care. I grabbed the oars and rowed with every ounce of strength I had, my arms burning, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The boat felt heavier with every stroke, as though something unseen was trying to pull it back. I barely made it to shore before the boat stopped violently. It was yanked backward, almost slipping from beneath me, as if the lake itself had come alive and was trying to reclaim me. I threw myself onto the sand, scrambling up the bank without looking back. My legs felt like jelly, but I forced myself to keep going until I reached the cabin. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, my chest heaving, my mind racing. For the rest of the night, I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, clutching a kitchen knife and staring at the door. Outside, the lake remained as silent and calm as ever, but I knew better now. It wasn't just water. It was something else, something alive. The next morning, I stumbled outside, still rattled from the night before, only to find the rowboat washed up on the shore. My heart sank when I saw it. Its bottom was clawed and splintered, deep gouges running through the wood as if something with razor-sharp talons had tried to tear it apart. That was it for me. Whatever courage I'd mustered the night before had evaporated. This wasn't a place for me anymore. Whatever was in that lake, it wasn't something I could fight or reason with. I had to leave. I rushed inside, throwing my clothes and essentials into my duffel bag with trembling hands. My only focus was on getting out as quickly as possible, but as I grabbed my things, my foot caught on a loose floorboard near the corner of the cabin. When I bent down to fix it, I found something underneath. A journal, dusty and yellowed with age. I shouldn't have opened it, but curiosity got the better of me. The pages were filled with frantic, scrawled handwriting. The words were jagged, the ink smeared in places, as though the writer had been shaking while they wrote. As I flipped through, my stomach churned. The entries described sightings of the same figure I had seen in the lake. How it appeared at dusk, how it grew closer each time, and how the writer felt its presence even when they were inside the cabin. The descriptions were almost identical to what I'd experienced, down to the splashing sounds and the wet footprints by the window. The final entry sent a chill through me.
It wants me. The lake wants us all. I can't leave. It won't let me.
I slammed the journal shut, my hands shaking, and threw it aside like it was toxic. It felt as though the air in the cabin had grown heavier, pressing in on me from all sides. I couldn't waste any more time. I grabbed my bag and bolted out the door, throwing it into the bed of my truck. My keys jangled in my hands as I climbed into the driver's seat and turned the ignition. Nothing. The engine sputtered once, twice, and then fell silent. I tried again, my pulse hammering, but the truck refused to start. Sweat broke out on my brow. There was no cell service out here, no landline in the cabin, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. I was stranded. I kicked the truck door in frustration and paced back toward the cabin, cursing under my breath. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, my frustration turned to fear. I didn't want to be here when night fell, but I had no choice. When the first whispers came, the sky was a deep, oppressive gray. They were faint at first, like the wind slipping through the cracks in the wood, but they grew louder as the night deepened. The splashing returned too, more insistent than ever, as if whatever was out there was pacing faster, growing agitated. I pressed myself against the cabin wall, clutching the knife I'd taken from the kitchen, my ears straining to catch the words in the whispers. I couldn't make them out entirely, but fragments slipped through. Come, water, can't escape. The walls seemed alive, humming with the sound, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I swore the shadows in the corners of the room were moving. I sat frozen, every muscle in my body tight, the knife trembling in my grip. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? It felt like the lake itself was breathing, its presence pressing against the cabin, waiting for me to give in. In the early hours of the morning, just before dawn broke, I heard it, the slow, deliberate creak of the cabin door opening. My breath hitched, and I froze where I sat in my room, clutching the flashlight I'd salvaged from the lake. The beam trembled, its faint glow barely piercing the oppressive darkness of the room. I thought I had locked the door. Was I going mad? I couldn't move. I was pinned in place. The whispers returned, louder this time, less like an echo and more like voices speaking directly into my mind. They were no longer fragmented. The words were clear and chilling.
Come to the water.
I tried to resist. I told myself to stay put, to fight the pull that seemed to tighten around my chest like an invisible chain. But it was in vain. My legs moved of their own accord, slow and mechanical, as if I were a puppet being guided by strings. The flashlight swung limply in my hand as I staggered toward the open door and stepped outside. The night was unnaturally still, the forest around the cabin silent and devoid of life. But the lake, oh, the lake was alive. It shimmered faintly in the darkness, its surface rippling for the first time since I'd arrived. The glow was unnatural, a soft, eerie luminescence that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. And then I saw it. The figure was no longer a distant, blurry presence. It was there, standing in the shallows, its feet submerged in the glowing water. My blood ran cold as I recognized the shape. Tall and lanky, with disheveled hair and hollow eyes. It was me, or rather, a grotesque version of me, stripped of warmth, humanity, and life. Its skin was pale and stretched taut over sharp cheekbones, its eyes sunken and devoid of anything resembling a soul. It was then I realized. The creature must have been watching me for weeks, studying my every move, every detail, until it had stolen enough of me to take on my likeness, a twisted reflection born from the lake's dark hunger. It raised a hand, beckoning. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. The pull was stronger now, dragging me closer to the water. My feet shuffled forward, the cold mud seeping between my toes as I neared the lake's edge. The figure tilted its head, its lips curling into a faint, joyless smile that sent shivers down my spine. In that moment, something inside me snapped. A primal, desperate instinct to survive surged through me, breaking whatever spell the lake had cast. I stumbled backward, falling to the ground, and scrambled away from the shore on all fours. The figure's smile faded, replaced by something far worse: rage. The water churned violently around it, and I thought I heard a low, guttural growl, like the lake itself was roaring in frustration. I didn't stop to see what happened next. Somehow, I found my footing and ran, my legs carrying me faster than they ever had before. I didn't stop when I reached the cabin, nor when the forest swallowed me whole. I didn't look back. My only thought was to get as far from Blackwater Lake as possible. When I finally stumbled onto the highway, my lungs burning and my body shaking, the sun was rising. The light felt unreal, almost foreign, after the suffocating darkness of the lake. A passing car screeched to a halt, the driver rolling down their window to ask if I needed help. I couldn't even form the words to explain. I just nodded, climbed in, and left that cursed place behind. I never went back. My uncle sold the cabin soon after, claiming it wasn't worth the upkeep. I didn't argue, and I refused to speak about what happened to anyone who asked. But no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape the memory of that night. Sometimes, in the stillness of the early morning, when the world is too quiet, I hear the whispers again. Faint, almost gentle, like a lullaby meant to lure me back. And in those moments, I know Blackwater Lake hasn't forgotten me. It's still out there, lurking in the dark, its hunger endless, its whispers insidious. I can feel it clawing at the edges of my mind, calling me in a voice that's almost my own. And the worst part? Deep down, I'm terrified that one day my body will betray me. My feet will move on their own, and I'll find myself walking back to that cursed shore, back to the lake that never lets go. Back to the place that's been waiting all this time. For me.